That was fun. So I forgot the words. It's called making something up on the fly. Freestyle. Freestyle. Our theme for the month is when love calls. When love calls. Now I want you to think for just a moment. If I were to ask you to list the things that you love, just think for a moment. In fact, close your eyes for a second. Think of the things that you love. Go down your list. Okay, you may open your eyes. And as you think about the list that you made of the things that you love, my question for you is, how long did it take before you got to yourself? No. And some of y'all may have. But the thing that's important this morning, as the Master Teacher Jesus was once asked the question, what is the greatest commandment? And he, reaching back into the history of Israel and calling forth the commandment, said that first of all, that you should love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. Loving God with everything that you have. And then in the translation that I like says, while loving your neighbor as you also love yourself. And now a lot of people have feel as if they have the loving God part correct. They feel like they've got the loving God part in hand. And I won't go too much into it, but there are a lot of people these days, we are seeing a lot of things that are happening politically and socially with people who are imposing their version and their idea of God and who God loves and who God doesn't love on society. And we see laws, crazy laws in my estimation, that are being passed today, and people who are having conversations about all of that. And so a lot of times people feel like they have the loving God part in place, and they will do that without realizing and remembering that God, when it comes to the loving that God does with us and that God is expressing through us, and that God is not out there judging people and picking certain people and playing favorites with particular groups of people and condemning other people. But the very fact that you are living and breathing and that we are here is evidence. It is something that without fail helps us to understand just how much God loves us. God continues to love us. And as Meister Eckhart said one time, that I don't thank God for loving me because God can't help itself for loving. It's just simply the nature of who God is and the expression of the universe that continually gives and emanates love. But the loving self. And I'm going to get to the neighbor part too. Maybe not today, but I'm going to get to the neighbor part as well. But the loving ourself part can become oftentimes challenging, or a bit more challenging than we necessarily think about. And a part of that is because for so long we have been up against the messages and things that very oftentimes come from childhood on, where people will say to us, and people will say unkind things or do unkind things, or things will happen to us in such a way. And oftentimes we find ourselves carrying that baggage that is going with us, that is there, and we continue to bump into it. And oftentimes when we find ourselves almost at the peak of success, I don't know about anybody else, but there have been periods in my life where I felt like that I was there almost on the precipice of success, and things were going right, and I was feeling good, and things were happening right there, but there was always that feeling in the back of my mind waiting for the other shoe to drop. that something was going to happen, something was going to come along, something was not going to go quite right, and I was just waiting on it. I can remember when Emma and I talked about this, when we first started our relationship and started seeing one another and things were happening. We both were happy and things were going well and all of that, but there was a part of us that was like, is this really real? When's the other shoe going to drop? And because, you know, when we first meet people in relationships, I say this all the time, we meet their representative. We meet their representative. We think. But then, you know, after a little while, little things slip in, and we start to find out certain things about one another, and we reach that point at which I like to call awakened enlightenment. Where we find out the person that we held in that place is not quite as perfect as we had them. And then we have a decision to make. Do I accept this person where they are and who they are? Or do I do something else? And so we find ourselves there, but also with us. The thing that happens is those messages that we carry will have us when we're on the precipice of success, where we are in relationship, whether it's career, whether it's other things, other interests in our lives, that something in the back of our minds that says that this may not be all that it is. We come up against it. There is a situation I remember very distinctly and very clearly. There was a young lady at one of the churches where I served who had gotten up for one of the talent programs that we had there for youth. And she got her violin out, and she started to play, and she was playing beautifully. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of her playing, she yelled out, "I can't do this!" And she ran out of the sanctuary and just was in the back, just sobbing, just in tears. And I went and I talked with her, and then I remember years ago when I was in band, and I was a trumpet player, and all of my bandmates had the benefit of private lessons. I had come up through the public school system, and I can remember my first 3 years of band and everything, I had 12 different teachers. So every time I would get to a band practice, there'd be another teacher there, a new teacher. So things were all over the board for me. And while my classmates, as I got up into the upper levels and finally into high school, came through private lessons and all of that, I didn't have all that. And I remember at one of the solo competitions, I was standing there playing my trumpet. And all of a sudden, the same thing in the middle of it, I just stopped and just broke down crying and said, "I can't do this, I can't do this." So I could relate to her, but a lot of that went back to the taunting and the other things that some of my classmates did because I had to work harder. I didn't have the same benefit that they did. So those are the kinds of things that we find ourselves going up against when we talk about loving ourselves. And then we grow up in an industry, in a society where there are entire industries that tell us that if you don't have white teeth, if you don't smell a certain way, if your body is not a particular composition, if you don't own certain things, if you don't look a certain way, then you are somehow inadequate. You somehow don't make it. Just entire industries. Every time you turn around, there is either a product, a cosmetic product, or something else that will help us to look like how we want to look like, or they think that we want to look like, or something else. Or there is a drug, a pharmaceutical, that will help us with all kinds of things now, and sometimes you listen to them and the side effects are longer than what is supposed to be helping. But all of that thing helps us to feel like we aren't quite enough. And so when I asked the question, how many of you, when you went down your list, said that the thing that you love, where did you find yourself on it? Because if you don't love yourself, who else will? If you don't love yourself, who else will? I happen to think that I'm fabulous. And you should too. Not about me. It's okay if you do about me, but about yourself. Think that you're fabulous. I know we say that, but it's important for us to be able to say that we love ourselves, that we are answering the call to love. First off, to love ourselves. It all starts with us. It starts with ourselves. How many of you think about this? When you go into the bathroom in the morning, and you open up your, in my case, the medicine cabinet and wherever your toothpaste might be located, and you get your toothpaste out. How many of you squeeze the toothpaste from the bottom of the tube? How many of you squeeze it from the middle or from the top? Which way are we actually supposed to do it?
The top.
Ultimately, as long as it gets onto the toothbrush, whatever works for us. But we created these ideas in our minds that it's supposed to be a certain way. And I actually have had couples come to me. And one of the complaints that they will have about, one will have about the other, is that they squeeze the toothpaste from either the bottom or the middle or the top. And that's not how we did it in my house. Now, I know that there's deeper issues there, but that will be what they complain about with one another. And so often what happens in life, we have these scripts that we continue to use and to tell ourselves why certain things ought to be without recognizing and realizing and taking the time to examine them and to get our minds around why they are happening and why we are telling ourselves. But loving ourselves becomes important about that. Loving ourselves becomes the thing that we need to do, because when we don't love ourselves, when we talk about the law of attraction, that when we don't love ourselves, we tend to attract people who reinforce that for us. People who pick up on the keys, the clues that we're sending, and the energy, and just as they see us not feeling good about ourselves, then they will come around like vampires. They will come around like scavengers. They will come around and continue to reinforce those ideas for us. And we find ourselves in relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or relationships in other ways, with people who continually will abuse us and say abusive things to us and do abusive things to us, because we're in that place where we're not loving ourselves, where we're not feeling good about ourselves. And I know that's painful to talk about, but in reality, it's the truth. That when we begin to love ourselves, when we begin to know better, we do better. I can say that for myself, that I know what it means and what it's like to be in a situation, in a circumstance. I remember years ago when I lived in Dallas, in my very first marriage. I say I was young when it happened. When I got married, I probably, and I don't say there's anything such as a wasted relationship, but there were a lot of lessons that I had to learn, and I found myself in an abusive situation. And unfortunately, we had a toxic relationship, and there were things that I didn't feel good about myself, and I had attracted somebody who picked up on those things and reinforced those things verbally and physically. And here I was supposed to be a man, and I'm with someone who's abusive to me physically. And the thing of it is that people, it's difficult. We often hear of women who are in abusive relationships, and there are a lot of resources, but for men who are in that, it's different. And I was raised never to put my hand on a woman, so I didn't retaliate. But I was in that, and as I started to move through the process, and I got counseling, and I got other help, and all of that happened, one of the things that became very clear and apparent to me was one part of the reason why I was in there in the first place, because I went in not feeling good about myself. So I was looking to somebody to constantly affirm me, and constantly say things. So when on good days, when I was being affirmed, everything was okay. But on those days when it wasn't, I would get all that other kind of stuff. And I felt like everything was my fault. And it wasn't until I started to sort those things out from a spiritual perspective, from a counseling perspective, from other things like that, that I suddenly began to realize just how important it was to love myself. And you all hear me say this. I've told this story a million times, and I will continue to tell the story. Is that by the time I had reached the point at which I knew that the marriage would no longer work, things would no longer happen well, I was so depressed I didn't want to get out of bed in the morning. I didn't want to go. And the toughest day for me was on Sunday mornings when it was time to get up and go to church and stand in the pulpit and preach to people about hope and about how God is there with you and all of those things. And here I was feeling like a failure. Had to get up in the morning and get dressed and go there. And I knew the people there knew what was going on in my personal life and all of that. And it was one of the worst periods in my life. And then I read in a book something very simple. Like I said, you all heard this, but something very simple. Zig Ziglar, one of his books, he talked about taking out an index card and writing 10 things that you loved about yourself, 10 things that were good about you, 10 things that were worth it, 10 things. And that felt kind of hokey to me, but I started out and I got to maybe 4. And I stopped because I couldn't think of anything more than 4. I was that low at that point, but I kept on working on it. And finally got to 10. I fudged the last 2, got to 10, but I taped it to my bathroom mirror. And every time I got up in the morning and I looked in the mirror, I would go down that list and I would read those things out loud. In the beginning, it felt ridiculous. I was glad there was nobody else around to hear me or see me doing that. But at the time, I continued to read those things. I continued to concentrate on those things till those things not only became something that was written on an index card, but things I started to recognize in me. And as I continued to recognize those things in me, I didn't even need the card anymore because I knew them. I had taken them in to myself, and I continued to go down that list. And the last thing that I said in there and in that context is that I am a child of God. And as I continued to do that, and things started to happen, I remember as I moved on and took control and responsibility for my life, that one day I ran into my therapist after I had left one therapist and moved on and everything. She didn't even recognize me. I stopped and I told her who I was. And she was amazed. And she said, oh my goodness. I had tried all I could to save your marriage and do all of that, and I realized I needed to step out of the way. The reason why she didn't recognize me, I had lost weight. I had changed my appearance, my whole attitude, everything else had changed because I felt the value of who I was and of loving myself. The call to love that I wanted to talk about this morning is that which is calling to each of you, asking you to value who you are within yourself, to value your own life. And one of the things I had down this morning to share with this, and I'll end with that, is to be cognizant of the stories that we tell about ourselves. So many of the stories that we share with one another, that we share with people around us. So many of those stories we are actually rehearsing our pain and remembering our failures and all of that because we've been conditioned not to celebrate our victories and who we are. But I want to encourage you, rather than being caught up in the cauldron of pain, as I termed it in this, to begin to raise the chalice of celebration and celebrate who you are. Celebrate your awareness of who you are. That last line on that card that again, that I said that I am a child of God. I am a creation of God. And the master teacher, Jesus, talked again about loving God with everything that we have and loving our neighbor while loving ourselves. That from our teaching, from our perspective, if that God is everything and God is all there is that when we answer the call to love and we begin truly loving God, we can't help but to love ourselves. We can't help it because we are loving God and we're expressing all of that and feeling it and being aware of it and understanding that, and we can answer the call to love. Each of us, just how precious and wonderful and loving and giving and caring that you are. And anytime those words and those thoughts contrary to that attempt to come, just remember who you are. You are God in expression, wonderful, beautiful, loving, giving, caring, sharing. Yes, the glory is real. Understand that. And know that. Understand who you are. All this loving yourself stuff, sometimes people will dismiss it. I ain't going to dismiss it. I live by that, and I invite you to do the same.